All right, so if you will, open your Bibles to Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. Now my plan is that we get to verse 11, at least tonight. I won't make any promises, but I'm hoping to get to at least verse 11. So we're in Judges chapter 3. I put 3 to 31 because that takes us to the end of the book, but there is no way we'll be going through the whole chapter tonight, so don't, because we'd really have to be going quickly and stuff. We were doing that, plus we wouldn't have any time to talk about anything. So Judges chapter 3, and what I want to do is start out with looking at verses 1 through 6 first. We'll catch verses 1 through 6. Now we see we're getting into the Judges, and of course we know that tonight in chapter 3 we have the three judges: Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. So we have the three judges that we're going to look at. Now let's just take a brief second, because go to the next slide, Brian, if you're not already there. Just a second to get and talk about Israel's story, because we know God had laid a special plan on Israel, and we've talked about this before, but I just want to lay it out there for you so we get the idea of where we're at. Remember that Israel was in Egypt. While he was in Egypt, through Moses, God delivered Israel out of Egypt, and of course the Passover happened when in the 10th plague that the firstborn was killed when the death angel came in Egypt, if they had the blood over the doorposts and things. That was the Passover, and the ones got to live, or the firstborn of that family got to live then. And of course we know it took them, and then it led them to the crossing of the Red Sea as Egypt chased them. And certainly we know that God led them out of bondage. And this was God's plan for them. And then he took them into the wilderness. Now we know that this should have just been a very short journey for them, really, just a couple of years for them to get to Egypt, to Canaan, or the Promised Land. It really should have just been this couple of years that happened. But because they were not permitted, because of the continued sin of Israel, because they continued to do because they were grumbling and whining and complaining, they were told that, listen, you're not going to get to the Promised Land for a number of years. And of course, we know that was 40 years later that they got it. And of course, even Moses at that time, or the only two that out of that was really allowed to enter the Promised Land was Caleb and Joshua, because remember, they were the only two that out of the 12 spies that were sent in to spy out the Promised Land, they were the only two that came back with a good report saying, hey, God is with us. He can take care of us. He'll take the land. And then, of course, we see Israel in the Promised Land, led by Joshua, was led across the Jordan after Moses' death into the Promised Land. And, of course, they came into the Promised Land, and it was there for Israel. And, of course, Israel, or the land at the time, Canaan, was their inheritance. And so as a result of that, we know that through chapter 2 now, in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we've gotten this history of Israel to this point in Judges, where we saw that they simply were what? A generation after generation had come now, and this generation was not taught the word of the Lord. They failed to remember God, and because of that, God has now sent them into this cycle of sin that we've talked about a number of times. You'll see it on your thing, but we'll get there because I want to go through this brief review here real quick. And it really is just outlining that cycle of sin that you'll see in the picture. I know in your outline it didn't come out, but you guys have got that enough. You get the idea. First of all, the cycle in the book of Judges that Israel goes through on a number of occasions. Israel did evil what was in the sight of Yahweh. Yahweh gives them the hand of their oppressors. Because remember, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and all these ites are still in the land. God wanted them gone. He wanted them out of there. He had a specific purpose for it, and they failed to do it. And then because they failed to do it, Israel serves the oppressor for, I put X number of years, just, a number of years. Then we see what happens. Israel cries out to Yahweh. Yahweh raises up a deliverer, a judge, who we're going to start getting into tonight and looking at these judges. The oppressor is subdued at that point in time, and then the land has rest for X number of years. And then we see this as a cycle. We see this roundabout thing, and we said that this occurs 7 times in Judges. As we looked at it, it occurs 7 times in Judges. But it's not only a cycle, but it simply is a downward spiral for Israel. It's a continuing pattern for Israel. And this continuing pattern continues to go on. And it doesn't seem like every single time that it happens that it gets worse for them. It really gets worse for Israel. Just go ahead and see, we know what that cycle is up there. I know it didn't, for whatever reason, it didn't print that out on your thing. It just gave the numbers in there. I don't know why it did that, but it who knows, something in the printing, I guess. Israel then, go to the next slide, Brian. Israel gets worse, and so do the judges. When the book ends with Samson, although he delivered God's people, he was hardly an example of morality. And we know that. We know what Samson was like. We know what he lived like. The earlier judges were actually closer to God, while the people are closer to God. We see this relationship at the beginning that happens with them. And these 3 that we're going to get into in chapter 3 really represent a more ideal judge than the later judges do. So these first 3 are more closer to where God wanted these judges to be and where the children of Israel should be than where they were. Okay, Brian, the next slide. And just a kind of thing as God paints the portrait of deliverance, we must be careful not to limit the ways in which He can deliver. And we know that as we look at this, as we see this with the judges, we're going to start to see exactly the different ways that they get judged. Now, the 3 deliverance stories that we see here in chapter 3. First of all, we see the background in verses 1 through 6. Then we see Othniel in verses 7 through 11. Ehud in 12 through 30, and then we see Shamgar in 31, and doing it there. So let's go to and start here in the background, and let's really look at this in the background of this. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 for me. Somebody read verses 1 through 3 for me. Okay, that's good, Shirley. Thank you. Now, what's going on here in the verses? First of all, in the first part of this, in chapter 1 or in verse 1 here, we see the nations which the Lord have left. And why did He leave them there? Why did He leave these nations there? We should remember this not only because we know that He did this from both chapter 1 and chapter 2. He mentions this, but why, Greg?
He left them there to do 2 things. One, teach them war, how to wage a war, because they'd have to.
Yeah.
And the other was to punish them with it.
Okay, all right. To be what? What did it say in the other passages? I don't have it with me here. I should have put it out. But in the other passages it said what? Because you failed to follow my commands, because you failed to do what I said you're to do, what happens here? He says, I'm leaving them there for you, to be a thorn in your side, to be constantly there, that you're battling with them all the time. And we think of this, particularly when we get down here in into verse 1 here, as we look at this, that He might test Israel by them, that is all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. So this generation didn't know anything about the wars, didn't have any clue about the wars, might have heard rumblings about stuff, but didn't have any idea about it. And so as a result, He left them there essentially for punishment of this generation. Now, what Greg said here is in verse 2, this was only so this generation, the children of Israel, might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formally known it, and stuff. And we think, boy, that's kind of bad. You want the children of Israel to know war. But they've got to understand this is going to be an ongoing battle for them. God understands that this is going to be an ongoing thing for them. And because it's going to be an ongoing thing for them, they need to know how to war. We might think, well, why, I don't know so much anymore, but it used to be, why are you taking your kids to karate, and all that kind of stuff, and that kind of thing, and people get on people for, why are you doing that? I want my kid to be able to defend himself, to protect himself, the same kind of thing here goes for Israel. He wants them to be able to protect themselves from these things that are going to happen. Now, he knows what's going to happen. We know that he's sovereign and control. He knows exactly what's going to go on here. So he needs them to be ready to do his battle for them when he calls upon them to do it, because he knows eventually he's going to raise certain people up. He's going to raise these ones up to come to them and deliver them out of it. Now look at verse 3. Now we see these, in verse 3, we see these, namely these different groups that are there. First of all, the 5 lords of the Philistine, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, and so these are all there as part of this test to Israel. They're right there for them always, that they might know how, that they simply are there to always put them to the test. Now, when they put them to the test, we see that there's a problem with this too. We know there's a problem with this because what happens as a result of it? As a result of them being in there, we're going to see this later on in the passage here in verse 6. When we go down there, we'll just go ahead and look at verse 6 now. And they did what? And they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. And again, we've mentioned this several times already too, that what? That because of this, because God wanted these all driven out, this was the whole purpose of driving out everybody out of Canaan, so that they didn't what? So that they weren't intermarrying. You wonder sometimes, when you go back and you're reading through the Bible, and particularly when you're reading through the Old Testament, and like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and even Exodus, I'm trying to think of all the ones that have it, but because there are a number of them, but all these generations are listed there for us. We see one tribe after another listed, and its lineage and all of that going on, and you think, well, why did God do that? Why do we even have to know all this stuff? And of course, what's God trying to show us in the Old Testament? He's trying to protect that lineage from what? From the beginning to what? To Jesus. He's trying to protect that lineage. So that lineage was important to God. Why? You remember last year at Christmas, we went through the genealogy of Christ. We went through that whole listing in Matthew chapter 1, and we see the importance of lineage because it establishes how the Messiah was going to come, and it lays all that out for us. So lineage is important to God. And so this is important to God from the standpoint of what? That when they intermarry, they do what? They interrupt that lineage. They simply interrupt the lineage. And as a result of that, it becomes very disturbing to God for that. Now look at verse 4. And they were left there that they might test Israel by them. And you look back, here's the thing that relates this back to verse 1, where it says that he might test Israel. He says this again here in verse 4, that they were left that they might test Israel by them to know whether they would obey the commands of the Lord. And you see, this not only was important in Israel, but it's important for us today. We saw that when we went through the study, as we've been going through the study in 1 John. Obeying God's commands are important for us as Christians, but it was just as important for Israel to learn how to obey them. And yet, this generation didn't know them, weren't necessarily taught them, and because of that, they strayed away from the commands, which he had commanded what? By the fathers, by the hands of Moses. In other words, that should have all been passed down from one place to the next. It should have all been given down right from one to the next. And because it wasn't, what happens? They simply walk away from those commands. They go away from the commands of the Lord. Now then, look at verse 5. Thus the children of Israel dealt among the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And so they dwelt among all of these different groups. All these people that weren't supposed to be there in the first place, they're now dwelling among them. And of course, then what happens as a result of this, because they didn't know God or know His commands, because of that, what happens here in verse 6? They took their daughters to be the wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods, and they chased them up. Now, I put this list up here. I think it's up there now. I put this list up here when we look at this, because I want to ask the question, why is this so easy for them? You know, why was it so easy for Israel, you know, who should have known, who should have had an idea, who should have been taught, why you need to stay away from all these tribes here listed in verse 5. Why you need to stay away from them. Why you shouldn't let your sons and daughters marry them. Why you shouldn't be in interracial with them in any way, because the race needed to continue to be pure. You know, so why was this? So, I listed several things up here. First of all, I thought one of the first things you see when you ask this question is, there were short-range benefits to Israel if they did this. You see, there was certainly going to be peace with these guys. They didn't have to worry about fighting with them for a little bit. They didn't have to worry about these kind of things. Because what? Because now we're intermarrying with them. Okay? So, chasing after this other religious system for them, once they intermarry with them, chasing after that religious system has really short-term benefits for them. You see, it allows them to be, you know, at this peace, if you will, even though they're really not at peace, that they're at peace with this group because they're at this point with them. The other thing here the second thing I put down here is self-gratification immediately. You know, again, they get gratified right away. They don't have to worry about anything with these guys. All the benefits are right here before us because we're partnering with these guys. Everything's okay, and so there's self-gratification immediately. You know, there's nothing else we have to worry about. And we know that the cults that they served, the cults that they were involved with, particularly, and I'm not going to remember which one, I think it was the Canaanites, particularly the Canaanites, and of course the sensuality was approved of, and so it gave them license essentially to do anything they wanted to do. You know, the cult prostitutes and all this kind of thing, it gave them this license to do anything. And what else did this do? It took them into this idea, number 4 here, this low ethical standard that was tolerated. You know, when the standard is low and everything is being tolerated, it's easy for us to say, well, you know what, we might as well jump on board from that because everybody else is doing it. You see? Now, as Christians, we shouldn't be doing that. And we see the tolerance of the world today because the definition of tolerance today is much different than when I was growing up. You know, when I was growing up, tolerance didn't mean the same thing it means today. You know? And for us as Christians, what it means is that we should just keep our mouth shut and never say anything about the sin in the world and never call anybody on the carpet for what they're doing because it's just, you know, we're bigoted and we're loudmouthed and we have no right to say those kind of things because everybody does everything in their own way anyhow. You know, so we see this low ethical standard, and because that's tolerated, it continues to go on. I mean, we see that today. I mean, our country's in that state constantly. I mean, just look at these 2 presidential candidates we have. Both of them are, well, I'm not going to get into the political discussion, but it's just that kind of thing that you see today, that who we come up with. We can't even, well, never mind. But, well, it is terrible. But, you know, and then you look at number 5 here, other sins are approved. It's easy for us to stamp a mark and approve other people's sins. You know, when we're in a religious system and we're intermarrying with this religious system then that says, listen, anything's approved, anything goes, everything's all right, it's easy for us to approve those things pretty quickly. And it becomes easy for us to do that because everything's okay then. And then number 6, because of all these things happening, what happens to us? Visibly idol worshiping is okay then. You see, doing that is okay. What got Solomon in so much trouble? Because he never tore down the high places. You see, that's what got Solomon in trouble. You know, well, not only his problem with women, but his because what happened? He all these other concubines, all these wives and everything that he had, what happens to him? He never tore down their high places. He went and worshiped with them too. And so God told him, remember what God told Solomon? He said, listen, because you've done this, I'm going to make you the wisest person in the world. I'm going to make you completely the wisest person in the world. But listen, if you continue to obey my commands, I'm going to give you a long life. But what happened with Solomon? He didn't have a long life because he failed to obey the commands. Because what did he do? He worshipped in other places. other than where God wanted him to do. After everything that he did, and Solomon did a bunch of great things, but we saw how he finished his life. I mean, that's why he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. I mean, because he's come to the end of his life now and thought, man, I blew it. You know? The Lord our God should be above everything else, and that's really what, when you put Ecclesiastes into the framework of everything, and you shake it up real good, and you pull it out, and you say, man, yeah, he's right. You know, Lord our God should be above everything else. And so we see this. It's easy for us to do this. Selfishness then is condoned. In other words, what do we preach in the New Testament church? Loving others and doing for others above ourselves. And here, when we look at this, when we see what Israel does, they see what? Selfishness then is condoned. It's easy to condone that selfishness. Because, see, that works good for us, doesn't it? Because I'm selfish anyhow. I mean, Sandy will tell you I'm selfish. You know? And because I'm selfish, what? It's easy for me to condone that and say, yeah, because I'm selfish, everything's okay for me. You know, and so as a result of this, you see what happening here. It's easy for us to move into the stray of going in with these other groups or these other times. You know, here's the problem I want to pull it from Israel to today real quick here. Today, when we get into this idea of ecumenicalism, when we start looking at ecumenicalism and deciding that every other religious system has something for us to offer. You see, when we get into this point of doing that and saying, in 1986, a bunch of evangelicals got together with the Roman Catholic Church and they wanted to sign what they called the Evangelical Accords. And if you've never studied or never have any idea about what I'm talking about, you can go back and look it up sometime. But what the Evangelical Accords basically said was that the evangelicals and the Catholics are going to work together, and there were some big-name evangelicals back then going to sign this accord. You know, but there were some other evangelicals saying, listen, we can't sign that accord. And the reason they couldn't sign that accord was because one key statement in there says that, yes, we understand who the Lord Jesus is, but listen, there are kind of other roads to get to heaven through it. And when you start signing documents like that, when you start looking at, when you start saying it's not grace alone, through faith alone, through Scripture alone, then when you get to all those points, you're really tearing down the gospel and you're watering down the message of the Word. And see, we can't do that. We can't do that. You wonder why I'm so strong about those kind of things? Is because when we allow that stuff to creep into the church, it destroys the church. It will take it. We saw the 7 churches. You already went through the 7 churches. It's amazing how I can point to every sermon I give, you know. And so, but we saw this in 7 churches, didn't we? As soon as sin started to creep in, it creeped in and took over the church, basically. You know, and so as a result, we have to understand that today when we look at this. Then what else? When we also see this, because as a matter of formality, we see other relationships, business relationships, other relationships start to improve. Because just as in Israel, as it is today, commerce is a matter of fact, isn't it? We've got to live with commerce. We've got to trade things. We have to, buy things to live on and all this kind of stuff. And so what happens for Israel at this time, here, having this relationship with all these other groups did what? It made commerce easy for them. It made these business relationships easy. Then what happened in number 9? Practices loosely regulated and not demanded. You see, when we start to say that, hey, it's this loosey kind of thing that you can just kind of, again, going back to doing whatever you want, everything's fine. It opens us up to allow all kinds of things, and then we don't demand anything. You know, we said this Sunday, what are 2 things that Jesus Christ demands of us? Love and obedience. Those are 2 things that He demands of us. That's not easy. It's not easy. And we all know that. If you've been a Christian for a long period of time, you know that love and obedience are not easy. It's not easy for us to do this. And so when we look at these loosely regulated practices, now I'm not talking about legalism here. Don't think that I'm talking about that, because legalism is not necessarily obedience. Legalism is a set of rules made up by somebody to say, hey, we've got to follow this. That's what the Pharisees did. But when we have these loose practices, say we can do whatever we want. Here, I'm just going to make a comment on the side here. This does not reflect the feelings of First Baptist Church of Amelia or any place else, or any other Southern Baptist institution. This is the danger of the community church. See, this is the danger in the community church. Because when we start to think that, hey, everything is okay for us to do, everything's all right for us to do, we start to give a sense that everything is going to be okay. And then all of a sudden there are a lot of people in these community churches today, they're going to find out they're going to be in hell when they get before their Maker. You see, because we loosen the message up so much that it becomes so... Now, let me say that doesn't mean every community church is doing that. I'm not saying that at all. There are some out there that are very good, but there are other ones out there that are leading people completely down the wrong path. You know, because they want to have their stage that looks like a rock concert every week. And it's not that I think the music is... Because music can always be loosened up a little bit to attract a younger crowd sometimes, but when we water down the message so much that it completely takes it away from Jesus Christ, then we can't ever do anything to move them forward again. And that's what happens in the thing when we start to loosen practices up so much. Compromise and cooperation is practiced, and I've already kind of mentioned that a little bit, that we see this being practiced, and because it's practiced, man, I want to get to here. And because it becomes practiced, it again waters down the message, and then there's no concern for others expected. You know, that we really don't care what anybody else does. We don't care about it, and because we don't care about it, it's ultimately going to be left up to everything else. All right, with that, let's get down to verse 7 now. Down to verse 7. And go to the next, just pull the whole slide up, Brian. So we see here Othniel, and so now we're introducing the first judge that we're going to be dealing with, Othniel. Somebody go ahead and read verses 7 through 11 for me. 7 through 11. Ashtaroths. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother.
The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave 60 kings in number into the hands of Othniel, king of Aram. So the land had 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, so what do we see here in verse 7? We see, first of all, that in verse 7 that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baal and the Ashtaroths. You know, again, serving, pulling them away, doing what? Again, they just never get it. You know, it's like you just hope, you know, even though we know the whole story, you know, we know the whole thing that's going on and things, it's sometimes just, when I'm reading through this, particularly as I'm doing my yearly Bible reading and stuff, I just want to, it's like you just want to wake them up and shake them a little bit and say, did you not understand this? God told you. You knew this or should have known this. But yet every time you hear this, what? So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they continued to serve those. So now what happens? The anger. So this is the lessons we get from these three guys here as we begin to look at it. Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Ultimately, everyone will need a deliverer. They're key deliverance triggers. Once our confession of our need. So, and we see this in our cycle of sin, don't we? We saw it in our cycle of sin. You know, we saw the sin, then the servitude, and then the supplication, and then comes the what? The salvation, and then back to the respite period, the time where they're at. And so here's what, and of course we claim out to God and plead for His mercy, and because we plead for His mercy, God delivers each one of them. And each one of God's deliverance stories is unique to that judge. And so we'll see this as we go through these judges. Now I listed out the three here just so we got it. Of course, Othniel and the Syrians, essentially that's the Cushan, and I can't even, whoever the king of Mesopotamia, I can never pronounce that last word anyhow. And either. So then we see Ehud, the Moabites, the Amorites, and the Amalekites, and then of course Shamgar with the Philistines. So we see what exactly they're going to do. Now let's just take a look at Othniel, because he's our first judge here, and we see that So what happens here? Verse 8, therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. He sold them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia, and the children of Israel served Cushan for 8 years. So where are we at in the cycle here? Remember our cycle? We see this cycle going on. What happens? There's this rest period. We see the sin here in verse 8, where it says what? That they were sold into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia. So we're now what? I can't remember the first S. I can't remember what it was. But this rest or whatever it is. Then we go down to sin, and now we're what? We're in servitude. And how long did they serve the king of Mesopotamia? 8 years. And so what happens now? See our cycle coming around? See why I put that in there every week? So you'd remember that little cycle going around. See? That as that wheel goes around, kind of, we then see what? We see the servitude, we see that for 8 years, and then what happens? We see the supplication that they're crying out in verse 9. And when they cry out, they're crying out. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, and see, here's the mercy of our God. Here's the mercy of the God. Because he doesn't even say anything here. He doesn't press it and say, well, listen, you got to do this, this, and this before I reach out my hand to you. You know, he just does what? The children of Israel cry out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel. You see? So now their supplication, essentially their prayer to what? To God does what? Brings them salvation. And we see Othniel here. Well, let's look at Othniel. He's the first judge, is considered by some. A lot of commentators will mention this. He's probably the best judge of all the judges of Israel. And really, Othniel is the model for judges in Israel. Go to the next slide, Brian. Each of those, even though each deliverance is a unique story, Othniel against the Syrians, there was nothing ever negative said about Othniel. Nothing ever negative said about him. And there was no doubt, no immorality, no deception in his victory. In other words, everything that he did was right in the sight of the Lord. You know, and a lot of times I think we think, well, it's not much of a storyline for us. You know, where's the excitement? You know, I think it's Ehud that pushes the thing in there, you know. He's got to lie to deceive to get into the king. He's left-handed instead of right-handed. And isn't that who that is? Isn't Ehud that does that? You know, so all this kind of deception and everything that we want to read in a good plot line and everything. Well, this Othniel's story is kind of boring for the most part. You know, but we know that God uses what? Uses boring people, and we see here what Othniel did. He did just as he was asked to do, and didn't make a big fanfare out of it. We know that with Othniel, because what happens? Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. And so what did he do? Because now, in going back to verse 1, what happened? Or verse 2 in here, Israel now was prepared for war. They delivered up a judge to bring the salvation to Israel, and because of that, Othniel went out to war, and he delivered them from the hand of the king of Mesopotamia. And so they prevailed over that land. And apparently, after that, kind of Othniel just went about a business and accomplished and did what God wanted him to do. And because of that, what happens now? We see that Israel now, for 40 years now, has what? Has rest. You see? And we see that happening then, that Israel now has rest for 40 years. And they're going to do it. And then Othniel's, God's deliverance takes surprising forms. Othniel's way was kind of expected, the way that it was done. There wasn't anything unique about it other than just going and waging war against them. But God had give them into the hand of Othniel. And that Othniel truly served without any recognition. He truly served them without getting any recognition, without having anything going on. And you see what happens here. Because of Othniel's favor, because of what he has done now, certainly he's registered in here in the in Scripture for us to give us the idea about what he did with everything. I'm looking for a verse here. Hold on. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Now, go down with me, if you will, to verse 32, because now we know in Hebrews chapter 11, that's the faith chapter, or the essentially the Hall of Fame of faith for us. And it's not that Othniel is mentioned here, but in reality, he is mentioned here in a certain way. He's not brought out. But let's look at verse 32. And what more shall I say? Now, remember, the writer of Hebrews has already given us all these other people that have done all these things by faith, who've done all these great things by faith. Abraham and Moses and Noah and blah, all the way down through to verse 32 where we're at now and stuff. And so, what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who, though face subdued kingdom, work righteousness, obtain promises, stop the mouths of lions, quench the violence of fire, escape the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight of the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead and raised others. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had the trial of mocking and scourgings, yes, the chains of imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sown in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered deserts and mountains and dens and caves on the earth. And then verse 39, and all these, having attained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise of who? Of seeing Jesus Christ, but doing this all what? Before God having provided them something better for us, that we should not be made perfect apart from us. And when in verse 32 here, all the way down through, I think really to the end of the chapter there, I think at least I feel that these were these others who overcame, and Othniel certainly, while he wasn't mentioned here, he certainly fits within this pattern of all of these other ones that were given. While he didn't get recognition for what he did, he didn't step up and say, look at me, look how great I am, look at all this kind of stuff that did. Othniel lived a model that was an example to God, and because he did that, he was able to deliver Israel out of the hands of the king of Mesopotamia. And it certainly gave a good report for him because of his faith that he had. And it's because the Lord came upon him and led him to that point. Okay, next week, we'll get into Ehud, and we'll talk about him. I don't know if we'll get through two of them. We might. I doubt it, but we'll try. But we'll get at least through Ehud next week. I'll just have to see how the verses square out and everything.